In February 2024, a small Spanish town was shaken by a brutal crime that defied all appearances. A dedicated mother, religious and seemingly exemplary, was found dead in shocking circumstances, her naked body, with her head wrapped in plastic bags, tied up and abandoned in the back seat of the family car. The most disturbing part? The main suspects were her own adopted children. Stay until the end to understand how and why two adopted children transformed a story of love and hope into one of Spain's most disturbing tragedies. And if you're not yet subscribed, subscribe to our channel to not miss real case videos like this one. To understand how such a brutal tragedy could happen in an apparently ideal family, we need to go back in time and better understand who Silvia López was, the woman behind this devastating story. Born in 1976 in Vizcaya, in the Basque Country, Silvia grew up in a traditional and religious environment. From a young age, she stood out for her exemplary behavior. She didn't drink, didn't smoke, and maintained a meticulously organized life. For her parents, Isidoro and Loli, she was like an angel on earth. Her devotion to family and Catholic faith was notable in every aspect of her life. As a daughter, she maintained daily contact with her parents, calling every night to check on them. At church, she dedicated her free time as a catechist, being adored by the children she taught. On social media, she shared positive and inspiring messages about Christian values. As a professional, she worked at the University Hospital of Cruces, demonstrating her spirit of service to the community. But it was in her role as wife and mother that Silvia seemed to truly shine. Married to Javier Gonzalez, she faced with apparent serenity the long periods of absence of her husband, who worked in a metallurgical company and frequently traveled for work. Instead of complaining about loneliness, Silvia transformed this situation into an opportunity to dedicate herself even more intensely to family. Her dedication reached the point of giving up a promising career as an engineer to dedicate herself fully to her adopted children. In the community of Castro Urdiales, a quiet city of 33,000 inhabitants, Silvia was seen as the perfect example of maternal self-sacrifice. Neighbors described her as a constant and positive presence, always smiling while taking the boys to school, present at every Sunday Mass with the family, participative in community events, available to help when someone needed. For all who knew her superficially, Silvia represented the ideal of a devoted Christian mother, patient, loving, and completely dedicated to family. How could someone so apparently perfect have her life ended so brutally, precisely by the children she had chosen to love as her own? To answer this question, we need to go back 14 years in time, when Silvia's dream of motherhood began to take shape. Even in seemingly perfect families, there is always that unfulfilled desire, that dream that seems to always be slightly out of reach. For Silvia and Javier, it was the blessing of biological motherhood and fatherhood that eluded them. In 2010, after years of frustrated attempts and unanswered prayers, the couple faced one of the most important decisions of their lives. Sources don't reveal exactly why they couldn't have biological children, whether the problem was with Silvia or Javier, but this mattered little in the face of their strong desire to form a family. The adoption process wasn't a decision taken lightly. The couple spent months researching different agencies, consulting various children's homes, both in Spain and abroad. They underwent numerous evaluations and interviews, preparing themselves emotionally and financially for the new phase that was to come. It was then that, almost 7,000 kilometers away, in a small orphanage in Russia, they found what seemed to be a divine sign. João, a 4-year-old boy, with expressive eyes and a shy smile. Silvia's heart instantly connected with the child through photos and reports. But destiny had other plans, or perhaps an additional test of faith. During the process, they discovered that João had a younger brother, Arthur, just 2 years old. For many couples, this could have been an obstacle. After all, adopting 2 children meant double the financial responsibility, greater adaptation challenge, and an even more dramatic change in their lives. However, for Silvia, deeply guided by her faith and moral values, the idea of separating 2 brothers was unthinkable. As she herself shared in one of her social media posts, "God doesn't give us burdens greater than we can carry." Javier, despite natural financial concerns, supported his wife's decision. The bureaucracy that followed was extensive and tiring. Multiple trips to Russia, endless piles of documents, interviews with authorities from both countries, and psychological evaluations followed while the couple prepared their home to receive not one, but two children. Finally, after months of waiting and preparation, João and Arthur arrived at their new home in Spain. The photographs from that day show Silvia radiant, with tears in her eyes, holding her two children for the first time on Spanish soil. Javier, normally more reserved, also couldn't hide his emotion. The community of Castro Urdiales received the children with open arms. The grandparents, Isidoro and Loli, immediately fell in love with their grandchildren. Everything seemed perfect, two children who needed a home finding a family that overflowed with love to give. However, as in all fairy tale stories, there are always details that remain between the lines. What no one knew at that moment was that this decision, taken with so much love and hope, would be the first step in a trajectory that would end in tragedy. The invisible challenges didn't take long to manifest. As the years passed and the children grew, the reality behind that apparently perfect family began to show its first cracks. What neighbors saw from outside, a dedicated mother taking her children to church every Sunday, hid an increasingly complex and suffocating family dynamic. As João and Arthur grew, their world seemed to shrink. While other neighborhood children played freely in the streets of Castro Urdiales, the brothers lived a rigidly controlled routine. Their lives revolved around a restricted triangle: home, school, and church. Friendships were discouraged, social encounters were rare, and supervision was constant. Silvia, who in the community's eyes was the example of maternal devotion, governed the home with inflexible rules. The boys' education went far beyond the common. It wasn't just about good grades and good behavior, but about a relentless pursuit of perfection. Any grade below exceptional was cause for long sermons and punishments. Closer neighbors began to notice disturbing patterns. The raised voices that sometimes escaped through the windows didn't match the image of the exemplary family everyone knew. Some reported having seen João, the older one, occasionally with inexplicable marks, but the explanations always involved casual accidents during play or sports practices. At school, the brothers were known for their impeccable behavior and exemplary grades, but few noticed their isolation. When invited to parties or activities with colleagues, they always had a ready excuse: family commitments, church tasks, extra studies. Over time, the invitations decreased, and their social isolation only intensified. Javier, always absent due to work, seemed oblivious to the growing tension in his house. His long business trips kept him distant not only physically, but also emotionally from the conflicts that were developing. When he was present, the family maintained the appearance of normality, like a well-rehearsed act that everyone knew how to perform. The grandparents, Isidoro and Loli, who initially overflowed with love for their grandchildren, began to notice subtle changes in the boys' behavior. The sparkle in their eyes that they had when they arrived from Russia had been replaced by a distant, almost resigned look. But, like so many others, they preferred to believe it was just a difficult phase of adolescence. No one could imagine that behind that meticulously constructed facade of an exemplary Christian family, pressure was building that, like a pressure cooker without a release valve, would one day explode in the most tragic way possible. The cracks on the surface were just the harbinger of a much deeper and more devastating rupture that was to come. The morning of February 7th, 2024 dawned cold in Castro Urdiales, a Wednesday that began like so many others in the Lopez family routine. Silvia, as usual, prepared breakfast for the boys before school. Javier was traveling for work, more than 200 kilometers away, in one of his frequent professional absences at the metallurgical company. The day proceeded normally. João and Arthur went to school, where they maintained their usual behavior: quiet, disciplined, practically invisible among their colleagues. Silvia followed her routine at the University Hospital of Cruces, where she worked as a janitor, always maintaining that serene smile everyone knew. In the late afternoon, the family gathered again at home. The sun was already beginning to set when Loli, the grandmother, tried to make her usual contact with her daughter. It was a tradition. Silvia never failed to answer her mother's calls, which happened religiously every night. But that day, something was different. Between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m., Loli tried insistently to speak with her daughter. The phone rang, but no one answered, something completely out of the ordinary for Silvia, always so attentive and present. Worry began to grow in the mother's heart, until finally, after countless attempts, someone answered the phone. It was Joao's voice, her oldest grandson, normally so controlled and polite, but now trembling in a way Loli had never heard before. The words that followed would freeze her blood. They were being held captive. The call, short and desperate, was abruptly interrupted. All subsequent attempts to call back went straight to voicemail. The phone had been turned off. Panic set in. Loli, with trembling hands, immediately contacted the authorities. The Spanish Civil Guard was quickly mobilized to the González López residence. The chalet, normally so well-kept and welcoming, was completely dark. Officers knocked several times at the door, their blows echoing in the disturbing silence of the night. With no response, they had no choice but to force entry. What they found inside the house told the silent story of a violent struggle. Objects knocked over, broken glass, stains that looked like blood in the kitchen. In the midst of the disorder, on the kitchen table, a note with a single word written by hand: help. The meticulous search of the house revealed no sign of Silvia or the children. It was only when the police reached the garage, accessed directly from the residence, that the true dimension of the tragedy began to reveal itself. The family car was there, but something was wrong. It was crashed against one of the walls. In the back seat of the vehicle, a scene that would forever haunt all present: Silvia's body, naked, with her head wrapped in plastic bags. Her hands and feet were tied with electrical tape, and the hip area was also covered with plastic bags. The woman who for years had been seen as an example of virtue and maternal dedication now lay lifeless, victim of shocking violence. The clock marked just after 9 p.m. Somewhere in the night, two teenagers had disappeared, leaving behind a scene of horror that no one could have predicted on that seemingly normal morning. The quiet city of Castro Urdiales was about to discover that sometimes the greatest tragedies hide in the most unlikely places, behind the doors of apparently perfect families. With Silvia's body found and the boys missing, the Spanish Civil Guard initiated a massive search operation. The first suspicion, as in similar cases, fell on the husband Javier. However, this line of investigation was quickly discarded. He was more than 200 kilometers away, at his metallurgical company, with dozens of witnesses confirming his alibi. The city of Castro Urdiales transformed into a police fortress. Patrol cars monitored every corner. Barriers were established at all city exits. Police officers searched cars, checked trunks, and interrogated drivers. The community, shocked by the crime, voluntarily mobilized to help in the searches. The boy's grandmother, Loli, remembered a crucial detail: Codolino Park, a location on the edge of a cliff where her grandchildren used to go frequently. It was a privileged green space, with wooded areas that could serve as a hiding place. Investigators concentrated their efforts in that direction. Around 2:15 a.m. on February 8th, the siege closed in. In a remote area of the park, agents located the two brothers. Arthur, the youngest, was captured without resistance. Joao, however, attempted a desperate escape through the wooded area, being detained moments later. The kidnapping story began to crumble like a house of cards. Investigators discovered that, after the call to their grandmother, the boys had discarded their cell phones off the cliff, an act that suggested premeditation, not the desperation of kidnapping victims. During the period they were missing, they were seen at a local bakery, buying snacks with complete tranquility, as if it were any ordinary day. In the first interrogation, the brothers remained silent, denying any involvement in their mother's death. But evidence began to accumulate. Forensics found bloody clothes discarded in trash bins near the residence. The knife used in the crime was identified. It was from the family's own kitchen, suggesting that the attack was not an impulsive act, but something planned. It was Joao who finally broke the silence. In an interrogation room, before experienced investigators, the 15-year-old teenager began to reveal a story that no one could have imagined. His voice, previously firm and polite, trembled as he described years of alleged psychological and physical abuse. He spoke of severe punishments for low grades, of constant pressure for perfection. But something didn't quite fit in this account. Investigators discovered that, despite the allegations of abuse, no formal complaints had been made. Teachers and school staff, interviewed during the investigation, described the brothers as exemplary students, with no visible signs of mistreatment. The school counselor, with whom João claimed to have shared his problems, had no records of any alarming conversations. The brutality of the crime also didn't correspond to the boy's profile. The preliminary psychological evaluation showed no mental disorders or deep traumas that could explain such violence. On the contrary, both demonstrated a disturbing lucidity when reporting the events of that night. As the investigation progressed, an uncomfortable truth began to emerge. The crime presented clear elements of premeditation. The choice of timing, when their father was traveling, the way they executed the plan, the methodical disposal of evidence, the attempt to forge a kidnapping, everything indicated a level of planning that made the story even more disturbing. The true dimensions of the horror only came to light months later, during the judicial hearing in November 2024. What emerged from official documents and testimonies painted an even more disturbing picture than anyone could have imagined. That fatal February afternoon, what initially appeared to be an impulsive confrontation revealed itself as a calculated ambush. According to judicial documents, João and Arthur had meticulously planned the attack. They waited for the moment when Silvia was alone in the kitchen, having her meal. The plan was cruel in its simplicity. Arthur would hold her from behind, while João would execute the attack. The violence of the crime shocked even experienced investigators. Forensic reports revealed that Silvia had suffered 3 deep wounds in the neck region, plus multiple injuries to the head. The marks on her body told the story of a desperate struggle for survival. She tried to defend herself, tried to escape, but had no chance against her 2 attackers. But it was what happened afterward that really disturbed investigators. After Silvia lost her life, the boys demonstrated a calculating coldness that no one would expect from teenagers. First, they methodically removed their own bloodied clothes. Then, in an apparent attempt to contain the bleeding, or perhaps something more sinister, they covered the victim's head with plastic bags. The most shocking revelation came only during the trial. Evidence of post-mortem violence was discovered. The judicial document specifically mentions that the crime had a libidinous component, with indications that Silvia's body was violated after her death, before being wrapped in plastic bags. The boys' behavior after the crime was equally disturbing. After tying up the body with adhesive tape and transporting it to the car, they simply went to a local bakery to buy snacks. Security cameras showed them acting with frightening naturalness, as if they had just completed an everyday task, not an act of extreme violence. The most disconcerting aspect for experts was that nothing in their psychological evaluations indicated any type of mental disorder. There were no signs of psychopathy, sociopathy, or any other disorder that could explain such brutality. The boys demonstrated full awareness of their actions and their consequences. When questioned about their motives, the justifications seemed disproportionate to the brutality of the crime. They spoke of strict rules, of punishments for low grades. Common teenage complaints transformed into justification for an act of extreme violence. The prosecution highlighted in their allegations that the premeditation of the crime and the coldness after its execution demonstrated a level of calculation that went far beyond a simple act of teenage rebellion or response to alleged mistreatment. The way they planned the false kidnapping, how they tried to manipulate evidence, and mainly, how they maintained calm in the following hours, suggested something much darker than initially imagined. The case left a disturbing question hanging in the air. How could 2 young people, raised in an apparently loving environment, educated, and with no history of violence, commit an act of such brutality against their own mother? It was a question that not even the most experienced professionals in the field could answer with certainty. The Spanish judicial system found itself facing an unprecedented dilemma: how to adequately punish such a brutal crime when those responsible are minors. The final decision, announced in November 2024, generated intense public debate and left a community divided between understanding legal limitations and the clamor for justice. For João, who was 15 years old at the time of the crime, the Public Ministry for Children and Youth of Cantabria requested the maximum penalty allowed by Spanish legislation: 6 years of detention in a closed regime. If he had turned 16 when he committed the crime, he could have received up to 10 years of imprisonment. The sentence came after an agreement between the defense and Silvia's family, including Javier, the adoptive father, who filed a private action against his son. The details of the sentence revealed the complexity of the case. Of the 6 years of detention, 5 correspond to Silvia's murder, while the 6th year was added due to the post-mortem acts of violence. The court considered the circumstance of kinship as an aggravating factor, and no mitigating factors were recognized. Not even the allegations of supposed physical and psychological abuse were accepted as justification. In addition to the detention period, João will have to serve 3 additional years of supervised release after his liberation. The judge also established a restraining order. He is prohibited from approaching within 300 meters of his father, grandparents, and maternal uncles for the next few years. An attempt by the judicial system to protect the family that was shattered by his actions. For Arthur, at just 13 years old at the time, the fate was significantly different. Under Spanish law, children under 14 cannot be held criminally responsible. Instead of punishment, the system provides for protection and re-education measures. Thus, he was sent to a child protection center under the tutelage of the Cantabrian Institute of Social Services, where he will receive psychological and educational support. The disparity between the brutality of the crime and the legal consequences generated outrage in the community. Residents of Castro Urdiales organized silent protests in front of the court, many holding photos of Silvia. How to accept that in a few years, those responsible for such a heinous crime will be free to restart their lives. The socio-educational center where João serves his sentence offers rehabilitation programs, continuing education, and psychological monitoring. If he maintains good behavior, he may have progressive benefits. However, any violation of rules or new behavioral problems may result in his transfer to an adult prison when he reaches majority. Silvia's grandparents, Isidoro and Loli, expressed their pain in a rare interview after the sentence. Every 15 days, they visit their daughter's grave, light a candle, and leave white roses. For them, no sentence could bring true justice. Their daughter is dead, and their grandchildren, whom they once deeply loved, are responsible. The legal community also divided over the case. Some argue that the Spanish juvenile justice system needs to be revised for exceptionally serious cases like this. Others argue that the purpose of juvenile justice is precisely rehabilitation, not punishment, and that more severe penalties don't necessarily result in greater justice. And you, what do you think about this disturbing case? Was justice really served? Is the 6-year sentence for such a brutal crime sufficient? Or do the limitations of the law for minors need to be revised? And what about Arthur, who could not be held criminally responsible due to his age? Is this understandable, or does it represent a failure in the judicial system? Share your opinion in the comments. If you're not yet subscribed to the channel, click the subscribe button and activate the bell to not miss any real criminal case videos like this one. See you in the next video with another surprising case.